Hi, welcome back to Healthy Families, brought to you by Healthy Food Guide, the podcast where we explore the practical tips and the expert advice to help families eat well through every stage of life. I'm Kathleen Alleaume.
And I'm Jess Burvill. And on today's episode, we're talking all about vegan diets and what to do if one of your teenagers announces they're going vegan. We'll run through what a vegan diet is, what to look out for when it comes to nutrition, what are some of the traps your teenager might fall into when first starting out on a vegan diet, and then we're going to give you lots of practical tips to help take the stress out of preparing meals that everyone in your family will eat. So, Kath, what are you observing around vegan diets?
Yeah, look, it's certainly becoming popular. In fact, the surveys are showing that a number of Australians and New Zealanders identify as being vegan. It is steadily increasing, but look, when you look at the whole population, it's roughly around 3%. So it's still quite small. Look, it's just a steady increase. But what we're seeing more of, though, is more plant-based meat alternatives in the supermarket. I mean, there's so many products now. I think there's over 300 products that you can see in the supermarket. So that's something to watch out for. But with this steady rise, many parents might be wondering, what does this mean for my family? Like, should I be concerned if my child or another family member decides to go vegan? So I think today we're really going to explore these questions and provide some of the insights to help families navigate this lifestyle choice. What do you think, Jess?
Yeah, look, that sounds great. And I think before we get into all the detail, let's just, for our listeners, give them a bit of an explanation of what a vegan diet actually is. Now, most of you have probably heard of a vegetarian diet, and vegan diets and vegetarian diets are similar in that they're both largely based around plant-based foods. Now, a vegan diet's a little bit more restrictive than a typical vegetarian diet because it also doesn't include certain foods such as honey, eggs, and dairy products as well.
So what would be some of the reasons why people would choose to switch to a vegan eating pattern? Like, I mean, some, popular examples might be, of course, the animal welfare, because you're omitting a lot of those animal-based products. Believe it or not, some may do this for economic reasons because it's about saving money as well.
Cost of living crisis.
And, of course, there's health reasons, thinking that doing this might be healthier, or you might actually be doing it to achieve and maintain a healthy weight. And, of course, we've got the religious and spiritual beliefs. But the question is really, speaking of health, and, one may do it for, losing weight perhaps. Do you think the vegan eating pattern is a healthier eating pattern compared to other diets that we may know?
Look, I guess I know we always say this when we talk about different types of diets, but when it comes to a vegan diet, the answer is it depends, because there's a right way to do it and there's also a wrong way to do it, and there's a lot of grey in between there as well. If we look at what the research tells us, it's not conclusive. We've got some studies that show people following vegan diets have improved health outcomes, for example, related to things like cholesterol levels and fasting blood glucose. But there's also some other evidence that shows some negative impacts, for example, lower bone density and higher risk of fractures. And I think at this stage, the evidence is not conclusive.
Yeah, and when it comes to kids, the evidence points to both risks and benefits associated with a vegan diet, but we definitely need more well-designed studies to get a clearer picture. So I guess while a vegan diet may be healthy, it's important to do it right with all those factors that we just kind of mentioned, right? So, it's really taking into consideration balance. So if you're minusing those food groups, you really need to kind of carefully plan it. So Jess, take us through some of the nutrients that we might be missing.
Yeah, there's quite a few to keep in mind. I mean, given that a vegan diet essentially is restricting certain food groups, and some of those food groups do contribute important nutrients to the diet. So we'll just go through a couple of the key ones. And I think the point to say up front is we're not saying that you can't meet your nutrient requirements on a vegan diet. It does just require a bit of knowledge and a bit of planning. So I think, that's probably a good time to also highlight that if your teenager does turn around and announce they are going to follow a vegan diet, a really good thing to do would actually be to sit down with your teenager and just check their understanding of the nutrients in different foods, and just make sure they already understand what they need to be mindful of when they're following this. So a couple of really important ones would be obviously protein. Now, most the foods that contain the most protein per gram do come from animal sources, and on a vegan diet, somebody is choosing to exclude those foods from their diet. So they need to be looking to other plant-based sources of protein to make sure they're meeting their requirements. And this is really important for teenagers because they're going through that growth spurt. And protein helps to make sure that their bones are going to develop correctly and all their muscles, etc. And if anyone was listening to our episode 5 where we talked about protein, you remember we touched on this idea that there's a number of essential amino acids that our body needs to produce muscle effectively. And when you're following a plant-based or vegan diet, you need to be eating a wide variety of those plant-based proteins just to make sure you're getting, that full range of essential amino acids in the concentration and amount that we need to make muscle. Now, a second one is vitamin B12. Now, B12 is found almost exclusively in meat, chicken, and eggs. And there's only really trace amounts of this vitamin in plant-based foods. So this is one particular nutrient that if somebody is following a vegan diet, they do need to be looking to supplemental forms of B12. So either taking a supplement or looking for foods which are fortified with vitamin B12. And a couple of examples might be things like plant-based milks or yogurts, if you have a look on the back of the label and check whether the product has vitamin B12 added to it. Now, related to protein and B12 is iron, which is also found in highest concentration in animal sources such as meat, chicken, and fish. So if someone's following a vegan diet, they need to be looking to sources of plant-based foods such as whole grains, nuts, and legumes, which have that higher concentration of iron. And another thing to highlight here is that when you're on a plant-based diet, the form of iron that's found in those foods, it's actually called non-heme iron, is actually less bioavailable, which means it's not as absorbed as readily as the iron that's found in foods such as meat, chicken, and fish. And that means that when you're on a plant-based diet, you need to eat a little bit more of these iron-containing foods to make sure that you're still meeting your requirements.
Yeah, I guess, Jess, and on that point too, with the non-heme iron that's found mainly in plant-based food, is actually combining that with a source rich in vitamin C, because we do know that consuming vitamin C, which is found in lots of vegetables and fruits, again, salads with meals, etc., is actually going to help absorb that non-heme iron.
Yeah, that's a really good example of how having some good knowledge around different nutrients, the role in our body and how they interact together can actually help you to meet your requirements when you're following a vegan diet. And that's a really good example.
And like you said before, that variety is so important. All right, and let's not forget calcium too. So we do need calcium for healthy bones and teeth. And of course, we're talking about teenagers now. So teenagers do require a higher amount of calcium in their daily requirements. So the average requirement for calcium is around 1,000 milligrams per day. But for teenagers, that actually jumps to like 1,300 milligrams a day. So I'll give you an example here. An average glass of milk, looking at a 250 ml serve, contains around 300 milligrams. So if you're looking at obtaining 1,300 milligrams a day, that's about 4 to 5 serves of milk, like glasses of milk. That's quite a lot, and that's quite a big jump. But if you're not consuming milk, of course, we do need to look to plant-based variety, and you need to look at some of those options with the calcium fortified. And things like cheese. So we've got a lot of vegan alternatives for cheese. Again, you've got to look out for things that, do have that fortification of calcium. That's really important.
Yeah, I mean, there is calcium found naturally in a number of plant-based products such as nuts and seeds and leafy green vegetables. But, as Kathleen said, the 1,300 milligrams a day is quite a high requirement for growing teenagers, and it would be quite challenging to meet that requirement naturally just through plant-based foods. You're probably going to have to look to some products which are fortified with that added calcium. So make sure you're checking out labels when you're buying things like plant-based milks and cheese, and choose those options which have that added calcium to them, because that will make sure that your teenager is, going to be well on track to meeting their requirements.
And I think we mentioned back in episode 1 or 2, like their peak bone mass, is reached at about the age of 18 to 20. So this is why the calcium requirement really does jump at this stage of the teenage years. And just finally, omega-3s as well. So omega-3s mainly found in the highest source of fish. And because you're omitting those animal foods, you're going to be looking at plant sources such as your nuts and seeds. So things like flax seeds or walnuts or chia seeds, adding that little bit of extra crunch to food. I mean, obviously, I think at this stage when you're teenagers, there's not so many nut restrictions in lunch boxes. So you kind of grow out of that phase and potentially growing out of a nut allergy phase. But this is a time to look into including a lot of nuts in your diet as well.
All right, now that we've gone through all the different nutrients you need to be mindful of when following a vegan diet, we're just going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to delve into some of the traps to watch out for when following a vegan diet.
Okay, we're back. So nutrients aside, let's go into now some of the common traps that people might fall into when following a vegan eating pattern. So Jess, what kind of traps have you seen?
Yeah, starting a vegan diet really is a bit of a real change to the way you've been eating. And one of the things I see quite often is that someone will focus too much on what they're cutting out of their diet rather than what they should be adding into their diet. Because if you are excluding quite a few of those big food groups from your diet, you obviously need to be replacing those foods with different foods. And often, particularly when it comes to teenagers, they're still quite young. This can see them introducing or needing to introduce new foods into their diet that maybe they haven't eaten too much in the past. So it's kind of going to be a bit of a journey of learning and exploring and finding out about different foods, things like tofu and tempeh, and eating more legumes than they have in the past. And this is, you can look at this as a really good opportunity for the family to be learning more about, the different nutrition in plant-based foods and how you meet your requirements following a vegan diet. So what we want to be doing is including a really wide variety of different types of plant-based foods, and ideally focusing on whole natural foods wherever possible, which leads us nicely onto the second trap that people may fall into, which is believing that vegan packaged foods are healthier than the product they're designed to replace. And whilst that might be true, sometimes, a lot of the time, it isn't. So we really need to be looking at labels and looking at that ingredient list and looking at what's actually in the product you're buying and having a look at the nutrition. So a key nutrient to highlight here is sodium. Now, sodium is often added to packaged and processed foods to help preserve them and to give additional flavour and mouthfeel. Now, so when you're buying a processed or packaged vegan product, have a look at how much sodium is in that product in particular. Now, our daily recommended limit for sodium is around 2,000 milligrams a day. So if you pick up something that's got, say, 1,000 or 1,200 milligrams in it, you probably want to be having a rethink of that, putting it back and looking for something that's got a lower amount of sodium in it.
That is a good point. Now, what I often see is not eating enough. Like, as you mentioned, Jess, I think people go into the approach of eating, following a vegan diet and feeling like it is quite restrictive. And with that restriction actually comes not eating enough calories or energy. Now, we're talking about teenagers here. And this is the time where that extra energy requirement is really important. So if you're cutting out animal protein or dairy, and without replacing them with equally nutritious food, that actually could end up under eating.
Yeah, a lot of the plant-based foods are naturally less energy dense than animal-based foods. So this is where really focusing on making sure that the things that are replacing those foods do have that, good amount of nutrition, particularly if you've got a teenager who perhaps is very active or playing a lot of sport. So Kath, in mind of all those different traps we've talked about, should a parent be worried if their teenager turns around and says they're becoming a vegan?
Yeah, sure. So while it might, as you mentioned, Jess, it's going to take a lot of adjusting initially, but despite those restrictions of following a vegan eating pattern, but as you mentioned, it's not thinking of it as restrictive, it's thinking of it as being inclusive. So with that right knowledge, as you mentioned, Jess, and of course that planning and appropriate food selection, you can rest assured, I think, that your teen will get all the nutrients and energy they need while following this eating pattern. So Jess, what would you say to someone then if they are concerned that their teenager's not getting their nutrient requirements?
Yeah, if you are worried about your teenager, perhaps you've noticed some new symptoms or you're concerned they're being a little bit too restrictive or not eating enough in their diet, it might be worth having a chat, with your local GP or even with an accredited practicing dietitian and chat about some of those concerns. So a few symptoms to keep an eye out for would be an increase in fatigue. Perhaps your teen is sleeping more than normal, or they just don't have their normal, the usual energy levels. Or perhaps they're getting a bit more run down than normal. You've noticed they're picking up every bug that's going around and getting sick all the time. Or it could even be in a change of mood. They, just don't seem to be themselves. I mean, they could all be things that are definitely worth getting checked out.
Yeah, and things like dry skin or even brittle nails I see quite a lot as well. So just any kind of physical symptoms like that too.
Yeah, because they could be signs of some of those nutrient deficiencies we talked about at the top of the episode. Okay, so now we've gone through all the traps to look out for. We're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, it's time to get practical, isn't it, Kath?
Let's do the practical wrap-up. Okay, we're back. All right, so let's just pull this all together using some examples of some real meals and snacks. So if your teenager is turning vegan, how do you apply all of this? What are you going to put on the dinner table? What are you going to put in their lunchbox? What would a typical day look like for a teenager who is following a vegan eating pattern? So Jess, let's start with breakfast.
Yeah, breakfast is actually probably one of the simpler or the easier meals to meet all your nutrient requirements on a vegan diet, because there's lots of options available, and lots of breakfast foods are naturally, vegan, or they're naturally plant-based. A couple of examples would be whole grain toast with a nut butter, or perhaps a whole grain cereal with a fortified plant milk like a soy milk, and topping that with some nice nuts and seeds and even some fresh fruit.
Lunch, we could look at falafels. I mean, they're quite a hit in my household. We could add that with some hummus and some salad. So again, it's an opportunity to incorporate some of those legumes like chickpeas. I mean, falafel's got chickpeas, hummus chickpeas, but lentils, things like that. You can add those to rice, or you can do like a bit of an Indian flavor with some dal, some whole grain riata. And snacks is a big one, because this is a real opportunity to meet those nutrient requirements. So, of course, lots of fresh fruits and vegetables. I mean, you can even try dried fruit like nuts and seeds or trail mix. If you're looking at soy yogurts to get your calcium, again, look for that calcium fortified variety. Muesli bars, nut bars. I mean, of course, we're omitting honey there. Dried legumes like those fava beans are quite good. They're quite crunchy, and they're really good alternatives for, like, say, potato chips or something like that. And, of course, popcorn too. I mean, they're a real hit in my children's lunchbox. But I think the dinners can get really tricky, because I think this is where you're actually getting the whole family involved in, like following a regular eating pattern. And so if you're a family that has a meal repertoire and then all of a sudden you're having to include vegan options, that's when it does get a really big tricky. So you definitely don't want to end up, for sure, cooking separate meals and having your teenager eat alone, because meal times, are that crucial time for that family bonding and family routine. So some suggestions there is that I would suggest is perhaps planning maybe 1 or 2 plant-based meals a week that everyone can eat. So most of us can benefit from eating more plants, of course. So maybe try focusing on a seasonal vegetable this week. So you could maybe look at starring cauliflower, you could star a zucchini or eggplant. So that could be something that you could base a dish around, but still not, completely omit meat or fish or chicken from the meal, but it could be something what's served up with a variety and including a star vegetable, for instance. So planning maybe 1 or 2 plant-based meals a week could be a great opportunity for everyone to look at new foods and introducing a different food to their meal. And another point here is making it inclusive and educational, because I think exploring vegan recipes together can be quite a fun and a great learning experience. Like, it's really a chance, like I mentioned before, to try those new foods and to understand their nutritional benefits. But I think here is a great time to actually involve the teenager, because they might learn culinary skills. They might learn how to cook a completely different food, and they might be cooking for the whole family, and it'd be great if they can freeze.
Wouldn't that be great?
They can freeze it and leftover. And, when they come home from school, they've actually got some meals that they've prepared themselves, and they can, especially if they're going to sport and things like that, after they've got something that they've prepared and they can eat.
So another strategy for taking some of the stress out of mealtime is making a vegan dish which you serve to your teenager as a main. So say something like a nice pumpkin and chickpea risotto, and then that becomes the side dish for everyone else at the table. So for the meat eaters, you could prepare some, say, meat, chicken or fish, and they can have that alongside that nice risotto dish. So in that way, you're not having to prepare lots of different separate meals for everybody, and everybody still gets to eat what they want.
Yeah, I think just that notion of creating a flexible meal pattern, so where it's easy for any member of the family to easily swap or omit one or two ingredients to cater for everyone's liking. So I give an example of pizza. I mean, or tacos. You might have lentils or kidney beans that they could easily put into their taco, but one could easily grab for the chicken or the fish. So you're not over-complicating things. You're just kind of maybe swapping out one or two ingredients. But I love your idea where it's a side affair for the meat eaters, but it's a meal, an actual generous meal for the vegetarian or the vegan in the family.
And of course, don't forget that healthyfoodguide.com has heaps of vegetarian and vegan recipes, and we often provide little tips for how you can easily convert a meal that maybe contains some animal protein into a vegan or vegetarian option. So do check it out.
Yeah, for sure. Now, I just want to add one final point before we wrap up, is that I think it's important to remember that veganism is not about perfectionism. So it's okay if you're not ready to fully commit. So if your teenager's not quite there yet, but it's just an opportunity for them to learn about different foods, well, that's okay too. Even if they're incorporating more plant-based meals into your diet, that is a positive thing. So just remember, it's not about perfectionism. It's not about restricting. It's about what you're actually including, and doing this as part of a family so the whole family can enjoy is really beneficial.
Well, that's it for today. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please do like and share it with your friends and family. And if you have any questions or need resources, check out our show notes for links. We look forward to seeing you next time on Healthy Families, brought to you by Healthy Food Guide. Bye.